I'm a widowed father of triplet daughters used to the pitying stares. Last week at the hardware store, I joked to old Mr. Henderson, "No woman wants a widower with triplets." I didn't see the quiet florist behind me, not until she leaned in and whispered, "I already do." I turned. Her name was Ivy. I barely knew her, but she'd been leaving casseroles on my porch every Wednesday for 2 years. Ivy. I only knew her as the florist who'd sold me funeral flowers 2 years ago and never said much else. What I didn't know was that she'd been the one paying my girls' ballet fees, tucking notes into my coat pocket, and leaving casseroles on my porch every Wednesday. Her own husband died before they could have children, and she'd spent 2 years mending my family from the shadows. That whisper was the first crack in a dam of secrets. By the time I drove home and my 3 daughters asked why the flower lady was crying, I realized I had to find out just how deep her love ran. I still remember my 3 identical grins in the rearview mirror that afternoon, their little voices chiming over each other. "Daddy, why was the flower lady crying? Did you make her sad?" I gripped the steering wheel and gave the only answer a tired father could. "No, Bobbies, I think she just remembered something good." But the words tasted hollow. I didn't know yet that the truth was already settling into our home, waiting for me to find it. My wife died 2 years ago. The triplets were 4 months old. There's no manual for a man suddenly alone with 3 infants who still reach for a mother who isn't there. For the first year, I survived on 2 hours of sleep and the kindness of strangers. Church ladies dropped off meals. Old Mr. Henderson fixed the porch step without being asked. But the casseroles on my porch every Wednesday were different. They always arrived before dawn, still warm, tucked into a soft insulated bag with a small card that read only, "For the girls." No name, no return address. I mentioned it to a neighbor once, but she just smiled and said the Lord works through many hands. I let myself believe that explanation because I didn't have the strength to question it. The other things were easier to explain away. An envelope with 3 crisp $50 bills slipped under my door the week the ballet school called about overdue fees. A winter coat exactly the right size for each girl, left in a gift bag on the church steps with my name on it. Encouraging notes I'd find in my coat pocket after errands in town. "You're doing a wonderful job. They see how hard you try. You're not alone." I told myself it was probably Mrs. Chen from the bakery or one of the older widows who knit in the library. The handwriting was always the same, but I never tried to match it. I think on some level I was afraid to know. Because if I knew, I'd have to look that person in the eye and admit I wasn't strong enough to do this alone. The day it all changed, I'd taken the girls to the hardware store for paint because they'd decided their playhouse needed to be purple. They were 3 identical whirlwinds in matching denim jackets, spinning through the aisles while old Mr. Henderson laughed and told me I had my hands full. I paid for my paint and made the joke I'd said 100 times. "No woman wants a widower with triplets." Mr. Henderson had heard it before. He was already shaking his head in sympathy. I didn't see Ivy. I didn't know she'd stepped out of the florist's shop next door to drop off a receipt. She was so quiet that the world had trained me not to notice her, but her whisper landed like a stone in still water. "I already do." I turned. Her eyes were red, her hands clutching the front of her green shop apron. She looked at me the way someone looks at a letter they've been too afraid to open. Then she turned and walked back into her shop, the little bell over the door jangling shut. I stood there, paint and cold against my leg, while Mr. Henderson suddenly busied himself with a clipboard. Nobody spoke. One of my daughters tugged my sleeve and said, "Daddy, why is the flower lady sad?" I didn't have an answer. I drove home on autopilot, the girls chattering about purple and butterflies, and my mind was stuck on Ivy's face. I barely knew her name. She sold me funeral flowers 2 years ago, soft white lilies that matched the blankness inside me. Since then, we'd exchanged maybe 10 words. Good morning. Cold day. Thank you. Nothing that would explain tears. Nothing that would add up to "I already do." That night, after the girls fell asleep in their tangled heap of stuffed animals and fairy blankets, I sat at the kitchen table and tried to think clearly. The quiet after bedtime was always the hardest. That was when the loneliness crept in. I pulled out the bills and paperwork I'd been ignoring. Ballet fees, daycare invoices, grocery receipts. In a manila folder at the back of the drawer, I kept the anonymous notes. I'd never read them in a row. 3 small cards, each still in their envelopes. You're doing a wonderful job. They see how hard you try. You're not alone. The last one had a tiny lavender sprig pressed inside. I lifted it to the light and a faint, peppery scent rose. It was the same dried lavender I'd seen tied to bouquets in Ivy's shop window. I stood up so fast the chair scraped the floor. The casserole dishes. I walked to the pantry and found the stack of borrowed containers I'd never returned because I didn't know who they belonged to. The insulated bag was still there, folded neatly. I turned it inside out, and there on the seam tag was a small embroidered flower with the letters IF Ivy something. The bag smelled faintly of rosemary and vanilla. My heart hammered in my chest. All those Wednesdays, the warm meals, the fees, the coat on the church steps. I suddenly remembered something else. A year ago, one of the triplets had a fever that wouldn't break. I'd spent 3 nights on the floor by her crib praying. On the 4th morning, I found a thermos of fresh soup on the porch with a note that simply said, "She'll be okay." At the time, I sobbed because I needed to believe it. Now I knew who had written it. I drove to town before sunrise, the girls still asleep under the watch of a neighbor I'd called in a panic. I parked outside the florist's shop and saw the light already on in the back room. Through the glass, I could see Ivy moving among buckets of stems, her movements slow and careful. Next to the register, a corkboard hung on the wall. Normally it held order forms and delivery schedules. But this morning something else was pinned there. I stepped closer to the window, pressing my palm against the cold glass. It was a photograph of my 3 daughters, clipped from the newspaper when they'd won the preschool pumpkin decorating contest. Someone had framed it with dried flowers, and scrawled at the bottom in the same handwriting I'd memorized without knowing were the words, "My reason." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then the bell over the door chimed and Ivy stepped out, a broom in her hand, and saw me standing there with tears I didn't know I'd been holding. Ivy froze in the doorway, broom still in her hand. The morning light caught the silver streaks in her hair and the deep shadows under her eyes. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she lowered the broom against the doorframe and said my name like a question, like she wasn't sure I was real. "It was you," I said, my voice cracking. "All of it." She didn't deny it. She just closed her eyes and nodded once, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She led me inside the shop. The air was thick with the smell of eucalyptus and old roses. The floor was swept clean and buckets of fresh-cut flowers lined the walls. She sat on a wooden stool by the counter and twisted her hands in her apron. I stayed standing, still trying to catch my breath. "You fed my children," I said. "You paid for their ballet, you wrote those notes." She looked up at me then, and her voice was barely a whisper. I didn't know how else to stay close. I thought if I actually spoke to you, you'd think I was some kind of lunatic. A woman with no right to your life, imposing herself where she didn't belong. She told me about the day of the funeral. She'd been asked to supply the white lilies because the local church trusted her arrangements. She was behind the counter when I walked in, hollow-eyed and holding a baby on each hip while a third lay in a carrier on the floor. She said I looked like a building that had been bombed out, still standing but barely. She watched me choose the flowers, fumbling with my wallet while one of the bobbies cried and something in her chest cracked open. She'd lost her own husband a year before. Cancer. They'd tried for children for 7 years, and then he was gone before they could afford another round of treatments. She said she buried him on a Tuesday and opened the shop the next morning because if she didn't keep moving, the silence would swallow her. When I walked into her shop that day, she saw a man trying to hold his family together while his whole world was falling apart. She wanted to help but didn't know how. So she started small. A casserole the next Wednesday. An envelope slipped under my door when she overheard me on the phone, pleading with the ballet school for more time. She told herself it was just charity, just kindness, nothing more. But every week, she found herself looking at the girls' school photos I posted on the door of the hardware store. She started pressing little lavender sprigs into the notes because she knew they smelled like the lotion my wife used to wear. She'd recognized it one day when I'd walked past her shop carrying a baby blanket that still held the scent. "I didn't plan to fall in love with them," she said. "Or with you. I just wanted to help." And then one Wednesday turned into a month, A month into a year into two. She looked down at her hands. I've been invisible my whole life. It was easier that way. I took the stool next to her and stared at the photo on the corkboard. My three girls in their matching pumpkin costumes, grinning with missing teeth. They know you, I said. The triplets. Every time we walk past the shop, Lily asks if the flower lady is sad. I never knew how to answer. Ivy let out a small, broken laugh. I gave her a tulip once. She said it looked like a princess wand. The other two demanded their own. We sat in silence for a moment, and then I did something I hadn't done in 2 years. I took another woman's hand. Ivy's breath hitched. You don't have to be invisible anymore, I said. Not to us. Later that morning, I invited her to dinner. She said yes, and I watched her face go through a dozen different fears in 3 seconds. She was terrified of meeting the girls properly, terrified of what my late wife's mother would say, terrified of the whole town's judgment. But she said yes anyway. That evening, I brought the triplets to the door when Ivy arrived. She wore a simple blue dress with tiny white stitching along the collar. Her hair was pinned back, and she held a bouquet of wildflowers, a smaller one for each girl. The girls stared at her with the unnerving intensity only 4-year-olds can manage. Then Maya, my boldest, pointed at her and said, "You're the flower lady, you cried." Ivy knelt down to their level, tears already welling in her eyes. I did, but I'm not sad right now. I'm very, very happy. She handed them the little bouquets and they erupted into giggles. Moments later, they tugged her inside to show her their stuffed animal kingdom, and for the next hour, the house was filled with the sound of small voices and laughter. I stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Ivy sit on the floor in her good dress while the girls piled bunnies and bears into her lap. Something in my chest loosened that I hadn't even known was tight. After the girls were asleep, Ivy and I sat on the back porch. The crickets were loud and the sky was clear. She told me about her own home, a small apartment behind the shop with a single window box of geraniums. She said she used to stand at that window at night and look toward my neighborhood, imagining what it would be like to have someone waiting for her to come home. I reached over and took her hand again. This time, she didn't flinch. Over the next 2 weeks, we built a quiet rhythm. She'd bring flowers for the shop display but stop first at the house to help with breakfast. I'd pick up the girls from preschool and they'd demand to visit Miss Ivy at the shop, where she'd give them a single stem to carry home. It was cautious and careful, and so tender I was afraid to breathe too hard in case it shattered. But then the whispers started. It was Mrs. Hargrove at the school who pulled me aside one afternoon. She was the kind of woman who smiled with her teeth and spoke in syrup. "Matthew," she said, "I just think you should know that some parents have noticed your friendship with Miss Ivy. They're concerned it might confuse the girls." A woman who can't have children herself, suddenly so eager to be around triplets, well, people talk. I felt a cold spike in my gut. I asked her what exactly people were saying. She wouldn't elaborate, but the implication was clear enough. I'd been in this small town long enough to know how quickly a kind act could be twisted into something ugly. I didn't tell Ivy, not at first. But the next Sunday, someone left a note on my car windshield. It was printed, not handwritten. Someone wanted to stay anonymous. "She's not their mother. She never will be. Don't let her replace what you lost." I crumpled it and threw it in the trash, but the damage was done. I started noticing the looks at the grocery store, the way conversations stopped when Ivy and I walked in together. Rosa from the bakery, who'd always been kind, suddenly couldn't meet my eyes. Ivy felt it too. One evening, she pulled back when I reached for her hand. "Maybe this is a mistake," she whispered. "Maybe I'm just a lonely widow who overstepped." I turned her face toward me with both hands. "You didn't overstep. You walked into a dark room and lit a candle without anyone asking. That's not the same thing." But the pressure kept building. The ballet school called to thank the anonymous donor and asked to feature the story in their newsletter. Ivy panicked. She begged me to stop it. She said if her name came out, people would say she'd been buying her way into my children's lives, that she was some kind of predator. I told her the truth was clearer than gossip, but I saw the old fear in her eyes, the fear of being seen, of being judged, of losing the only family she'd ever dared to want. I went to the school myself and asked them to hold off, but the principal said it was too late. A press release had already been sent to the local paper. The story would run in 3 days. That night I sat on the porch alone, staring at the stars. Ivy had gone home early, too upset to stay. My phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "You deserve to know the truth. Ask her about the bank account she set up for your kids. Ask her what else she's been hiding." My blood ran cold. I didn't know if it was true or just another rumor, but it planted the first real seed of doubt. I didn't want it to. Every fiber of my being wanted to trust Ivy completely. But the thought wormed its way in. What if her love had conditions? What if there was something she hadn't told me? The next morning I went to the shop before opening. The press release was 2 days away. I needed answers. Ivy saw my face the moment I walked through the door, and all the color drained from hers. Ivy's hand went to her throat. "What's wrong?" she asked, but I think she already knew. I held up my phone, the anonymous text still glowing on the screen. "I need to know about the bank account," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is it true?" She closed her eyes for a long moment, then walked to the back of the shop and pulled a binder from a locked drawer. She handed it to me without a word. Inside were bank statements, every deposit and withdrawal meticulously recorded. An account in my daughter's names, registered under a trust. The balance was nearly $40,000. Every spare dollar she'd made for 2 years had gone into it. Attached was a letter written on the same lavender-scented paper as her notes. It said, "For Lily, Maya, and Rose, so someday you can choose any dream you want the way your mother would have wanted." I read it 3 times before I could speak. "Why didn't you tell me?" She sank onto a stool, her voice raw. "Because I was terrified you'd think I was trying to buy your children. That's what people are going to say anyway, isn't it?" I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that nobody could twist a gift like that into something ugly. But even as the words formed in my mouth, I knew the town had already started. The press release from the ballet school was set to run in 2 days. It would name Ivy as the anonymous donor, the secret benefactor who had quietly paid for my daughter's lessons for over a year. I had asked the principal to pull it, but she refused. She said the school board wanted to promote a feel-good story to boost enrollment. She didn't care that it would expose Ivy to exactly the kind of scrutiny she'd been avoiding her entire adult life. The next morning, the story came out. The headline read, "Local florist's secret generosity keeps triplets dancing." The article was written with all the saccharine enthusiasm of small-town journalism. It painted Ivy as a selfless angel and me as the grateful widower finally catching a break. But the comments section told a different story. By noon, screenshots were circulating in the local Facebook groups. "She's been stalking that family for years," one commenter wrote. "Funny how she couldn't have kids of her own and now she's throwing money at someone else's," said another. The cruelest one, posted under an anonymous name, read, "A woman who buys her way into a man's heart through his dead wife's children is not a saint. She's a predator." My hands shook as I scrolled through them. Ivy refused to look at her phone. She closed the shop early and went home alone. That evening, the doorbell rang. I opened the front door to find Margaret on the porch, my late wife's mother. She was a tall, rigid woman with iron-gray hair and a gaze that could strip paint. She held a folded copy of the newspaper article in one hand and a lawyer's business card in the other. "We need to talk," she said, and pushed past me into the living room without waiting for an invitation. The triplets were in the playroom with the nanny, their laughter drifting through the walls, a painful contrast to the storm that was about to hit. Margaret sat on the edge of my sofa as if the cushions might dirty her. She unfolded the article and tapped Ivy's name with a long, manicured fingernail. "This woman has been inserting herself into your family behind your back. What do you actually know about her?" I started to answer, but she cut me off. "I've had my attorney look into her background. Did you know her husband died in debt? She nearly lost that flower shop 2 years ago. She's been barely holding on financially, and suddenly she has $40,000 to give your children. Where do you think that money really came from?" The implication landed like a slap. I had seen the bank statements. I knew Ivy had been depositing small amounts, $50 here, $100 there, every month. But Margaret wasn't interested in facts. She was interested in doubt. She pressed the lawyer's business card into my hand. "You need to protect your daughters. I can file for emergency custody if I believe they are in an unsafe environment. And right now, a woman who has secretly funneled thousands of dollars to your children and kept it hidden from you is not someone I consider safe. I stood up and told her to leave. She gathered her purse with a cold, thin smile. Think about it, Matthew. That money has strings. There's always a price. And if you can't see it, the courts will. She walked out and shut the door softly, which somehow made it worse. I sank onto the sofa and stared at the ceiling. The central question I had been avoiding finally crystallized. Why had Ivy really done all of this? Love, yes, but was there something else underneath it? A need to replace her own lost child. A form of grief she couldn't control. I hated myself for even thinking it, but once Margaret had planted the seed, it wouldn't stop growing. I drove to Ivy's apartment that night and found her sitting on her bedroom floor, surrounded by boxes of photo albums. She had been crying. She looked up at me, and I saw the same exhaustion I felt mirrored in her eyes. "I didn't mean to keep secrets," she whispered. "I just didn't know how to let you in without terrifying you away." She pushed one of the albums toward me. It was filled with pictures of my daughters, not creepy, hidden photos, but school portraits I'd given to her when she said she wanted to support them. Photos from the pumpkin contest I'd posted on the school board. A blurry snapshot I'd texted her last week of the three of them asleep in a pile. She said she kept them because they reminded her of the family she never got to have. "I know that sounds pathetic," she said, her voice cracking, "but you have to understand. After my husband died, I felt like I disappeared. I was just a woman behind a counter who sold flowers for other people's weddings and funerals. No one noticed me. No one needed me. Then you walked into my shop with 3 bobbies, and I thought, here is a man who is as invisible as I am, but he's still fighting. I wanted to help him survive. And somewhere along the way, I fell in love. Not just with him, with all 4 of you." I knelt beside her and looked her in the eyes. "Margaret was at my house tonight. She's talking about taking the girls." Ivy's face went ashen. "She can't. I'll give the money back. I'll disappear. I grabbed her hands. "No, I'm not letting you disappear again, but I need to know everything, Ivy. Every secret, every hard thing. No more shadows. If we're going to fight this, I need the whole truth." She took a deep, shaky breath and nodded. And then she told me the story she'd never told anyone. Her husband hadn't just died in debt. He had died owing money to a man named Richard Hargrove, the husband of the very same Mrs. Hargrove who had stopped me at the school. Richard Hargrove ran a small loan business on the side of his accounting firm, the kind that charged interest rates just shy of illegal. After Ivy's husband died, Hargrove tried to pressure her into selling the shop to cover the debt. She refused. She'd been paying him off in tiny increments ever since, and he'd been patient because he liked having that kind of power over her. But the day the newspaper article ran, Hargrove called her with a new demand. He told her he was tired of waiting. He told her she could either pay the full remaining debt, over $25,000 by the end of the month, or she could sign over the deed to her shop. And he had one more thing to say, a thing that sent ice through my veins. He said his wife had told him about the gossip at school, about the doubts people were planting. He said he could make all of that go away and he could keep Margaret off my back if Ivy agreed to one thing: she would walk away from my family for good. He would write off the debt entirely. All it would cost her was us. Ivy had been sitting on that for 2 days trying to figure out how to tell me. And now here it was, the full ugly truth. The town wasn't just whispering. It was actively circling, with real power and real money, and one couple, the Hargroves, was pulling strings to destroy everything Ivy had built with us. Margaret's sudden interest in a custody fight suddenly made a lot more sense. The Hargroves had likely fed her the information about the debt. They were running a coordinated campaign to make Ivy look unstable, to drive a wedge between us, and to force her out. I sat back on my heels and processed it. Then I asked the hardest question. "Were you ever going to take his deal?" Ivy lifted her chin, and despite the tears, her eyes were suddenly fierce. "No, I already sold my soul to grief once. I won't sell it again to fear. I would rather lose the shop and be homeless than lose you and those girls, but I couldn't ask you to fight a whole town. I couldn't ask you to choose me over your children's safety." I pulled her to her feet and wrapped my arms around her. "You're not asking," I said into her hair. "I'm choosing. Every time I'm choosing you." We held each other in that tiny apartment. the weight of the whole mess pressing down, but for the first time in days, we were facing it together rather than apart. I told her we would go to the bank first thing in the morning, figure out the debt, and find a way to neutralize the Hargroves. I told her we would call my own lawyer and preempt Margaret's custody threat. But most importantly, I told her the truth. I had finally accepted myself. You are not replacing her. You're not erasing my wife's memory. You're adding to our story. And if this town can't see that, we'll make them see, or we'll find a new town. The next morning, we walked into the Wheatland Savings Bank with a plan. The loan officer, a kind woman named Patricia who had known my parents, listened to the whole mess. She pulled up Ivy's and Hargrove's records and discovered something we hadn't expected. Richard Hargrove had been charging Ivy an interest rate more than double what was legally allowable under state law. Not only was the remaining debt unenforceable, but Ivy was actually owed a refund for the excess interest she had paid over the years. Patricia's voice went quiet with anger as she read the numbers aloud. This is predatory lending, plain and simple. I'm filing a report with the State Banking Commission this afternoon. It was the first crack of light in a very long week. Ivy laughed, a wet, disbelieving sound, and I felt a surge of hope. But even as we left the bank, my phone buzzed. A new message, this time from Mrs. Hargrove directly. She had sent it to a group chat that included several school parents and some church leaders. In light of recent revelations about Ivy Franklin's financial and emotional instability, we are calling for a special meeting with the preschool board to discuss the safety of the Vale children. All concerned parents are invited. The meeting was scheduled for Friday, 3 days away. There it was, the wait it gets worse moment. The attack was no longer behind closed doors. It was going public, and they intended to humiliate her in front of the entire community. They were going to try to label her an unfit person to be around my children. I showed Ivy the message. Her face went through grief, fear, and then something else entirely, anger, clear and cold. Let them, she said. Let them gather. I've been hiding my whole life. If they want a public fight, I'll give them one, but I'm not going alone. She turned to me and her eyes were blazing. Will you stand beside me? I took her hand. I'll be right there. So will Rosa and Mr. Henderson and Father Thomas and every person in this town who knows the difference between gossip and grace. That afternoon, we started making calls. Rosa agreed to speak on Ivy's behalf. Mr. Henderson said he had known Ivy's father and would tell anyone who listened that she came from good stock. Father Thomas offered to let us hold the meeting at the church fellowship hall instead of the school gym, a neutral ground that would blunt the ambush energy. We prepared a binder of evidence, the bank statement proving the legal ruling, the photo of the trust account for the girls, letters from the ballet school and the pumpkin contest organizers, and a written statement from me, the father, declaring that Ivy had my full trust and support. For the first time in 2 years, the quiet, invisible florist was stepping into the light, not to defend herself, but to fight for the family she had helped hold together. The night before the meeting, I tucked the triplets into bed and told them a story about a brave flower fairy who had been watching over them since they were very small. Lily asked if the flower fairy was real. I kissed her forehead. Yes, baby. And tomorrow, everyone is going to know her name. I walked downstairs and found Ivy on the porch, looking up at the stars. She was clutching a small wooden box. She opened it and showed me the contents, a pressed white lily from my wife's funeral, dried and fragile. I kept this, she said. I wanted to remember why I started, not for me, for her, because she couldn't be here and someone needed to make sure her bobbies felt loved. I sat beside her and put my arm around her shoulders. We didn't speak much after that. The quiet was enough. And now the town hall is in 3 hours. Richard Hargrove has been charged with illegal lending practices. Margaret has been told by her own attorney that a custody fight would be unwinnable. But the gossip machine is still grinding. People are choosing sides. By the end of today, either Ivy Franklin will be fully welcomed into this community, or we will both walk away from it. One way or another, this family is about to be reborn. The morning of the meeting, I woke before dawn and found Ivy already dressed, standing in the kitchen with a mug of cold coffee she'd forgotten to drink. She wore the same blue dress with the embroidered collar, the one she'd worn the first night she met the girls. I asked her if she was ready. She set down the mug and looked at me. I've been ready for 2 years, I just didn't know it. We dropped the triplets at Rosa's house. Lily, the one who always asked why the flower lady was sad, grabbed Ivy's hand before we left and said, "Are you coming back?" Ivy knelt down and kissed her forehead. "Always," she whispered. "I'm always coming back now." Rosa gave me a tight hug and slipped a small cross into Ivy's palm. "For courage," she said. "Not that you need it." The church fellowship hall was already half full when we arrived. The long folding tables had been pushed to the walls, and rows of metal chairs faced a small podium. Mrs. Hargrove was already there, standing near the front with a cluster of parents, her smile sharp and satisfied. Margaret sat in the back, arms crossed, her lawyer beside her. But on the other side of the room I saw the faces that mattered. Mr. Henderson in his Sunday shirt worn at the collar. Father Thomas, who had opened the hall without hesitation. Patricia from the bank, a thick folder under her arm. A dozen other neighbors who had known my parents, who had watched the triplets grow from infants to little tornadoes. They nodded at me as I walked in, Ivy's hand in mine. Father Thomas called the meeting to order. He said a brief prayer for wisdom and charity, and then he opened the floor. Mrs. Hargrove was the first to stand. She read a prepared statement, her voice dripping with false concern. She cited the anonymous donations, the secret notes, the undisclosed bank account. She painted Ivy as a grief-stricken woman who had fixated on a vulnerable widower and his children, who had manipulated her way into a family through money and emotional pressure. She used words like unstable and unhealthy and predatory. The worst part was that many people in the room didn't know the full story, and I watched their faces shift from neutral to uncertain. Doubt is a fast-growing weed. Then Rosa stood. She didn't have a prepared statement. She just walked to the front and faced the room with her hands on her hips. "I've known Ivy Franklin for 15 years, she said. "She made the flowers for my wedding and the wreath for my mother's funeral. She gave me free bouquets for the church when the budget ran out. And for 2 years I watched her deliver meals to a man who didn't even know she existed. She didn't do it for attention. She didn't do it to get something in return. She did it because she has the biggest heart in this town, and if you can't see that, then maybe you're the ones who need examining." She sat down to scattered applause and a few red faces. Mr. Henderson was next. He didn't say much, but his voice carried. "Ivy's father was my best friend. When he died, she kept his flower shop alive on sheer grit. She paid every debt he left, even the ones she didn't owe. I've never seen her ask for help or a handout. So when I hear people call her a predator, I get angry. That's not the Ivy I know. That's not the Ivy anyone knows if they've bothered to look." Patricia stood and read the bank's findings. She explained that Richard Hargrove had been charging Ivy an illegal interest rate on a loan she didn't even take out herself. It had been her late husband's debt, and she'd been paying it for years out of a sense of honor. Patricia announced that the State Banking Commission had opened an investigation. Richard Hargrove, she said, was no longer in a position to pressure anyone, and he had already surrendered his lending license. The room went very quiet. Mrs. Hargrove's face turned a shade of pale I'd only seen on cut flowers. Then it was my turn. I walked to the front with Ivy beside me. I didn't need notes. I had been rehearsing this in my head for days. I told them about the funeral lilies, about the casseroles on Wednesdays, about the notes in my coat pocket, about the night I found the thermos of soup when my daughter was sick. I told them that Ivy had paid for ballet lessons because she wanted my daughters to have something beautiful, something their mother would have wanted for them. I told them about the trust account, the $40,000 she had saved for their future, and that she had never once asked me for a single thing in return. "This woman," I said, my voice breaking, "has loved my children like they were her own. She has loved them before she ever thought she'd get to be part of their lives. She loved them from the shadows. And if that's not the definition of a mother's heart, I don't know what is." Ivy stepped forward then. She had been silent the whole time, but now she wanted to speak. She pulled out the small wooden box and opened it. She held up the pressed white lily, so fragile a breath could shatter it. "This is from your wife's funeral," she said to me, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "I kept it on my nightstand for 2 years. Every morning I looked at it and asked her permission." I said, Claire, can I help them? Can I be a small light in their darkness? I felt like if I talked to her, she might hear me, and maybe she'd tell me if I was overstepping. She paused, tears streaming down her face. I never got an answer, so I just kept doing what I could. I didn't mean to keep secrets. I was just so afraid that if I stepped into the light, I'd ruin the only family I've ever prayed for. She turned to face the room. You can judge me. You can say I'm broken. You can say I don't belong, but those three little girls know me and I know them. Their favorite colors are purple, pink, and yellow. Lily wants to be a veterinarian. Maya dances in her sleep. Rose can't fall asleep without her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Sniffles. I know these things not because I spied on them, but because I love them. I have loved them since the day I sold their father white lilies. A long, deep silence settled over the hall. Then Father Thomas stood. I think we've heard enough, he said. This meeting was called to discuss the safety of three children. I've seen no evidence of harm. I've seen no evidence of ill intent. What I have seen is a woman who gave sacrificially, who asked nothing in return, and who loved from a distance because the world told her she had no right. That is not a threat. That is grace. He looked directly at Mrs. Hargrove. I suggest we end this here, and I suggest we all go home and examine our own hearts. One by one, the parents who had been sitting with Mrs. Hargrove started to leave, their heads down. She tried to say something else, but her voice faltered and she followed them out, her husband's crimes now fully public. Margaret remained in her seat for a long moment. Then she stood, and to my surprise, she walked to Ivy. I was wrong about you, she said, quiet but clear. I was trying to protect my daughter's memory, but I think she would have been grateful. I think she would have thanked you. She held out her hand and Ivy took it. They didn't hug, but it was enough. By noon, the hall was empty except for us, the allies, and a few people who stayed to apologize. Mr. Henderson clapped me on the back. Told you, he said, eyes damp. Good people find each other. That afternoon, we picked up the girls from Rosa's. They ran to Ivy like she was the sun after a long rain. Lily grabbed her hand and said, Daddy told us you're our flower fairy. Ivy laughed and sobbed at the same time. Something like that, she said. Maya tugged her sleeve. Does that mean you can stay forever? Ivy looked at me and I nodded. Yes, sweetheart, forever. We drove home together, all five of us, and the farmhouse filled with the sound of little feet and too many questions. That night, after the girls were asleep, I stood on the back porch with Ivy and looked at the stars. You asked her permission, I said, every morning for 2 years. She leaned into my shoulder. Your wife was the strongest woman I never met. I wanted to honor her. I wanted to be worthy of what she built. I turned to her and took her face in my hands. You are. You always were. The final surprising detail came a week later. Ivy asked me to drive her to the cemetery. We stood in front of Claire's grave, and Ivy knelt down and placed a fresh bouquet of white lilies on the stone. Then she pulled out a small, weathered journal and showed me the entries. Every month for 2 years, she had come here and written a letter to my late wife. She told her about the girls, about me, about her fears and hopes. The last entry, dated the day before the meeting, simply said, Claire, I think you'd be proud of him, and I hope someday you'll be proud of me too. I knelt beside Ivy, and we stayed there in the quiet, the warm wind carrying the scent of cut grass and jasmine. In that moment, I understood that love doesn't divide. It multiplies. It grows to fill whatever space you give it. We walked back to the car hand in hand, and I knew without a doubt that the family I had lost was not gone. It had only grown, with a woman who'd learned to love from the dark, finally standing in the light. Sometimes I still catch myself watching her from across the room, just to make sure she's real. Ivy will be helping Lily with her homework, or braiding Maya's hair on the porch, or teaching Rose how to press flowers between sheets of wax paper. And I'll remember the man I was 2 years ago, hollowed out by grief, convinced that no one could ever want a widower with triplets. I was right in a way. No one did, but Ivy wanted us, all 4 of us. And she wanted us long before she ever thought she'd get to stand in the same room with us. The world trains some people to be invisible. It tells them their pain is too quiet, their love is too much, their grief has no right to take up space. Ivy spent 2 years believing that the best way to love my family was from a distance. She gave everything she had, her money, her time, her heart, and she did it knowing she might never get anything back. That's not naivety. That's the purest form of courage I've ever seen. What happened in this town is not unique. Every community has its Hargroves, its whisperers, its self-appointed guardians of other people's happiness. Every town has someone who hides in the shadows because they're afraid that stepping into the light will only get them burned. But every town also has a Rosa, a Mr. Henderson, a Father Thomas. People who will stand up when it matters. People who will say, I know her, I know his heart, and I'm not staying quiet. The question Ivy asked my late wife every morning, can I help them? Can I be a small light? That question is one we all carry in some form. Maybe you're the one who needs light. Maybe you're the one holding it for someone else and wondering if you'll ever be seen. If you're in the dark right now, I want you to hear this. You're not as alone as you think. Someone might already be leaving casseroles on your doorstep in ways you don't notice. A kind word, a small gift, a prayer you'll never hear. Love doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just shows up quietly and waits for you to be ready. My triplets don't remember a world without Ivy anymore. To them, she's not the florist who cried. She's the woman who taught them that flowers can mean 100 different things, that tulips are princess wands, that lavender smells like calm, that white lilies are for remembering. They don't see the scar of my grief when they look at her. They just see someone who loves them. And that's the whole point, isn't it? Real love doesn't require a perfect origin story. It only needs a willing heart. I still visit Claire's grave. So does Ivy. We go together now and we don't talk much while we're there. We just sit, the two of us, with the wild grass and the wind. I think Claire would have liked her. I think she's the one who sent Ivy to us. Not in some supernatural way, but in the way that goodness has a gravity of its own. Kind people find each other. Broken people find each other. And sometimes, when they're very lucky, they make each other whole. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to believe that love can find them, even when they've stopped looking. And if you're holding a light for someone in the shadows, don't give up. They might be closer to seeing you than you think. Subscribe for more true stories of ordinary people who found extraordinary grace when they least expected it. I'll see you in the next one.